Hey everyone, welcome back or welcome to The Growth Project, a podcast by AMPLOS. Dr. Cory Shaffer here today with Dr. Milt Lowder. Milt, good afternoon.
Good to see you, Cory. Glad to be on board.
So let's dive right into our topic for the day. This really comes from, us, I think, doing some brainstorming in the work that we're doing in performance psychology, primarily and across industry, sport, corporate world, doesn't matter. One of the really common things that I think, let's just say a topic that people struggle with is the fear of failure. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yeah.
But one that maybe people spend less time talking about, I would argue is a little bit more rare for us, but I have certainly seen it, I think, over the years. I'm sure you have as well. Sort of the opposite end of the continuum here, but the fear of success, which is really, really interesting to think about because so many people, that's all they want is quote unquote success, however they're defining it. So the fear of that, a lot of people are probably scratching their heads going like, man, what does that mean? So that's what we're going to explore here over the next little bit. Essentially, why do we fear both failing, but also succeeding?
Yeah, I think let's start, Cory, with the one that's a little bit more easily to understand is fear of failure. Mm-hmm. The fear of success is one, as you said, like that first thought is, that doesn't exist. But you can see it play out in different levels. But the fear of failure is one I think we can all connect to. It resonates with all of us that anytime, let's just kind of, you had to define what fear of failure really is. It's just anxiety related to a potential negative outcome. And we talk on here all the time. Anytime my focus shifts ahead to the outcome, and the closer you get to the end of a sporting event, the closer you get to the end of a quarter, say in a business cycle, the closer you get to the end of a life, that fear of failure kind of peaks ahead. There's usually an increase in anxiety and a decrease in confidence.
Yeah, and the fear here, to be clear, it's not necessarily that I'm fearing the result or the outcome just for what it is.
Yeah.
You lose the game, or you have a poor performance, or you don't hit your number for that quarter, whatever it might be. It's not inherently the fear of that. It's the fear of like the consequences of that or everything that comes with that. So that could be, negative consequences, shame, embarrassment, the devaluation, like whatever it might be. Like that is where the fear is coming from. Not inherently just like, we lost the game, but what happens when we lose the game.
Yeah, not only those internal feelings of shame and guilt and the negative narrative that you create about yourself, also that the consequences of letting other people down, whether it's people on my team, whether it's loved ones around me, not living up to those expectations, those consequences as well of what it means if I don't achieve this. What might it mean to me? What it might mean to others? How are they going to look at me? What are they going to think about me? How is it going to affect my future? You can see this happen. Just think about parenting. The fear of failure as a parent is the consequences are pretty significant and long-lasting for your children. Mm-hmm. And so it's so easy to parent from a position of fear. And fear, just to let you know, is just the most extreme form of stress or anxiety. You think about that continuum, the most extreme form and one of the strongest emotions we experience is fear.
To our point about how just prevalent this is and how many people feel this, again, everybody can probably resonate with this part of the conversation, but this has been researched now for almost 75 years. It goes back some early work done in the 1950s. So just to give you some context, and of course, that research, I think, has advanced and come a long way in 65, 75 years. And there are some different theories as to why that is. One maybe we'll talk a little bit about here, like performance avoidance goals.
Yeah.
Or linking fear of failure to avoidance oriented goal setting, So again, like the primary driver now is not necessarily to win, but to avoid losing. That's what that means.
Yeah, and if you're familiar with our podcast, you hear that a lot when we talk about Carol Dweck and her colleagues and her research around a growth mindset and a fixed mindset, and that avoidance goal orientation. That's what these mindsets really are, that if I'm in a situation, I've experienced failure, that it's easy to develop that avoidance goal orientation, that I'm going to avoid trying, I'm going to avoid taking the risk, I'm going to avoid trying out for the team, I'm going to avoid doing something different for fear of that failure. And I love the language you used, not necessarily the failure itself, but the consequences, the impact of that failure.
Mm-hmm. And one of the other themes here, or the theories here, and I actually do spend a lot of time teaching this in a one-on-one setting, especially stuff we've talked about on the podcast, though. But the fear of failure arising from perceiving performance as a threat. And so all that does is sort of kick, our brain, this fascinating, thing, but still at its core designed to protect us and to survive. And so if you interpret threat, it knows how to do one thing, and that's prepare your mind and body for an impending threat. So it kicks all of that stuff into high gear, and in a lot of industries, not just in sports, that's not necessarily the right kind of mindset and physiological state, emotional state to be in to perform at a high level, at least consistently. So, those are a couple of theories that kind of explain this. What are some of the signs that you might notice in someone who is maybe struggling with this fear of failure?
So the first one you might see, Cory, in this fear of failure is some perfectionist type tendencies. This language and self-talk around having to be perfect, the extreme words in terms of always and never, the sometimes you can see some obsessive tendencies and rituals and routines that seem prevalent in a person. This fear of failure comes with this increased cause of perfectionism. They're trying to control something that is out of their control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another one, and this is pretty closely linked to what I was just talking about a minute ago, choking under pressure.
Yeah.
So somebody who has prepared the way that they need to prepare, they're able to sort of do it in practice or in training, or let's just say when the lights aren't on, but then sort of the moment arrives, they get into a game situation, or the lights come on and all of a sudden they kind of can't do it. There's this huge disconnect. A lot of the time that's because of what I mentioned, because they're perceiving that event now as such a threat, like mind, body, everything is into, sort of just kicked into overdrive, just not in a great place to perform. So,
we're recording this a day after Tommy Fleetwood just lost a tournament, which he was leading by 3 going to the final round. He's never won on American soil. He bogeys 2 of the last 3 holes, but as I was watching that last hole yesterday, he's pounded his drive, middle of the fairway. Pretty much he makes par. He's going to get in the playoff if somebody else makes birdie. If he birdies, he wins. And he's 147 yards out, and complete indecision on club selection. Mm-hmm. Overthinking, kind of slowed down his decision-making process, went from a 9-iron to a pitch and wedge, hit it 50 feet short. And then, I think anxiety, that fear can either speed you up or slow you down. So then he gets really quick in his putting routine, leaves it 6.5 feet short, really quick on the next one in 3 putts. Mm-hmm. Keegan Bradley birdied and won the tournament. Mm-hmm. And so that you can see that anxiety, that fear slows you up, that physiological or speeds you up.
Hopefully it just helps, it validates some of what you've felt within yourself. If you're somebody who've ever feel like you have, suffered from that fear of failure. Let's shift gears here for a minute though. And again, this is maybe the one that people are going to be less familiar with, but let's just talk a little bit in the same type of way about the fear of success. So what are we talking about when it comes to the fear of success?
Yeah, I think, again, the consequences of if I achieve something, that's what we're thinking about fear of success. Most likely it's associated with some social or psychological factors. Social means, hey, think about young children and adolescents and teenagers. One of their biggest drivers, motivators, is to be accepted, to belong. And so a fear of success, someone in that is, if I achieve at a greater level, if I achieve some level of success, whether that's in the classroom or in athletics or in the performing arts, then I'm going to be different. I'm perceived as different. And so that fear of success, or those consequences of not being accepted, not belonging, being thought of, being ostracized. The psychological factor is now that if I achieve something, one psychological impact is now I have to have the pressure of keeping to do it. Mm-hmm. I have to live up to those expectations, and I don't want the burden of those expectations. I may have mentioned on here earlier, as Bon Jovi, I watched that 40th reunion tour as they were preparing for that. And one of the things he said at his age, he said, I still want to do something great, but I don't want the pressure of having to do something great. To me, that's like the burden of having to do that. That's a little bit of fear of success.
I think the last one hits the one that I think I've probably come across the most in people is just like, well, if I perform at this certain level, then what I've done is I've raised the bar for myself. And now I'm going to be expected, as you mentioned, to sort of do that all the time. And again, we actually see this quite a bit. I think unfortunately, think about how many sales organizations, like that's how they operate.
Yeah.
Right? Like, hey, you sold X amount of product this year. Well, guess what? We expect you to do that and then some next year. And if you do that, then guess what? We're going to ask you to do that again the next year and so on.
You've seen that self-sabotage happen. Like, hey, I'm going to get to that number and I'm going to shut it down because if I go, all they're going to do is raise the bar and then that affects my compensation.
Exactly.
So why would I outperform when it affects me in that way? That's a great example.
I think one of the other things here, like identity conflict, just how this can sort of, it just throws off the narrative that you have maybe about yourself or that you tell yourself. Those are a couple of things we're talking about here related to, fearing success. Again, this has been researched. It's taken a little bit longer for the research to come around compared to fear of failure. And again, that makes sense.
Cory, the research that I was looking at, the resources and the research and the literature really suggested around what you're saying, this identity is a little bit of the imposter anxiety. Mm-hmm. We talk a lot about the imposter syndrome, that I don't feel like I fit in or belong, that I'm outliving the expected norm based on my gender, based on my identity, based on my ethnicity, based on whatever that may be, that it's not like someone from whatever to achieve this. So this imposter anxiety is once you've achieved something, then your own doubts, your own fears, like, hey, did I just get lucky? Like, did this really happen?
Right.
And so some of that imposter anxiety can kind of drive that I'm not quite sure I can do it again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and similar to that is actually something, this was new in doing the research for this. I hadn't heard, and I think that's because this was coined in a different part of the world, called tall poppy syndrome, which is essentially the fear of being resented by your peers. Mm-hmm. So this negativity toward high achieving individuals. So instead of in what you're talking about, like, okay, I'm successful, and now there's this internal, like, do I even deserve this? Did I get lucky? Did I kind of just fall into this? This is now more of like, okay, do I even want to be successful to begin with? Because potentially of how people are going to start to view me and the negativity that can come from that.
Yeah, people don't like to see you do things that they don't think they can do or they aren't willing to do.
Yeah.
And we used to hear it a lot in our clinical practice of young people in our practice talking about, well, if I do really well on a test and all my friends are asking what I did, I'll tell them that I did worse, so I'll fit in. So they won't make fun of me or they won't call me a nerd. Mm-hmm. And so I'll downplay my scores, I'll downplay my results, I'll downplay my grade, my performance, just because I don't want to be excluded or made fun of.
Right. Yeah, so this is real. So whether the fear of failure or the fear of success, if that's something that resonates with you, we'll spend a couple of minutes here just what's happening just inside the brain, the body, that's driving some of this, and then we'll shift to what are the common coping mechanisms? Like, how does this actually kind of present itself?
Yeah.
So just first and foremost, just what's happening in the brain and body, a couple basic things here. And I alluded to this earlier, but our brain is wired very simply, first and foremost, for survival, right? So again, we interpret threat. That just activates our stress response, the amygdala. All of that just kind of kicks into overdrive. The sympathetic nervous system sort of gets all out of whack. So just starting there, like within the brain, that's happening. If you think about how elevated cortisol, which is the stress hormone, that can lead to avoidance behaviors, burnout over time.
Yes.
Those are a couple of things.
And
what
burnout is becoming an epidemic in sports, in business, in life, in medicine. There's huge factors of burnout. And so you think about the threats, this fear of failure, this fear of even success, those elevated cortisol levels, that amygdala is activated, that sympathetic nervous system is activated. With our autonomic nervous system, we sometimes aren't even aware of it. Mm-hmm. And we're constantly triggered. And so Then with that, kind of that perceived threat, then what are my thought patterns about myself, about my performance, about other people? And then what you create is this self-limiting belief, whether it's driven by fear of success or fear of failure, about yourself. And one of the things we know to be true, the story you continue to tell yourself about your life becomes your life. And that's driven by fear. So we can see someone's cognitive distortion start taking root with the beliefs they develop about themselves or about their performance or about how they compare themselves to other people.
Yeah, I mean, think about, it's easy to talk about this in sports, but think about just the kind of focus that is required to perform at the highest level of sport, let's just say. It doesn't have to be the highest level of sport. It can be, a high school baseball game. It doesn't matter. But the point is, to perform at a high level, it just requires sort of purely focused, fully present, immersed, engaged, ideally sort of that flow state where we're just fully into playing and not overthinking.
Yes.
Right? There's not a ton of conscious thought going on. So think about now the extra load that a divided focus from fear now causes, right? So immediately it's like, okay, yeah, now I'm supposed to be performing, but in the back of my mind, there's this sort of metacognition almost of like the implications of whatever it is I'm about to do. And so if I'm, on the pitcher's mound and I'm now saying like, well, if I walk this person, I'm going to walk in a run and we lose the game.
Yep.
Right? Do you think that's going to help you perform better or worse? You know what I mean? And that's kind of what we're getting at. Or even, hey, the bases are loaded. If I strike this guy out, that means we win. And what does that mean for me?
And in both of those situations, I've shifted my focus to the outcome.
Correct.
And anytime we do that, I'm just increasing that stress response. I'm increasing that cortisol. I'm increasing that anxiety and decreasing my confidence and taking me away from the present moment, which is where performance happens.
Yeah. So let's shift and talk about some of the common coping stuff. We'll start just motivation. So contrasting the fear of failure. There's an avoidance motivation. So we hit that earlier, but essentially instead of, hey, I'm playing to win, the motivation is now just don't lose.
Yes.
Right.
And I was actually speaking to a company here a couple of weeks ago in town and a question at the end, they said, do you think, fear of failure can drive success? And I think at a little stage, just go back to that stress performance curve that Yerkes Dodson, a little bit of, hey, I don't want to fail. I don't want to make a mistake. I don't want to not show up the right way, creates enough of a stress response to activate the brain, to engage the brain. So sometimes that fear of failure, if I can overcome the procrastination, the tendency to avoid it, gives me a little bit of energy to get going. Mm-hmm. But sustaining success over time cannot be driven by failure. Right. And we constantly tell ourselves, back to how we cope, whatever world you're in, don't make a mistake, don't get mad, don't screw up, don't strike out, whatever that language may be. And we constantly paint that picture of negativity. And unfortunately, our brain seeks to develop that picture.
Yeah. And then you contrast that, the fear of success, there's not necessarily an avoidance there, but it's more of an ambivalence.
Yes, that's such good language.
Even like a self-sabotaging, almost like I just don't care.
Yeah.
Right?
It's very laissez-faire, just kind of going through the motions.
Yep. And again, I think that's good language
really
too.
Good.
So now, again, how that's just impacting my motivation. Some of the other, sort of common coping strategies here, and we can kind of go back and forth. Where do you want to start?
Well, I think to me, procrastination is a sign of perfectionism that we talked about that sometimes be driven by this fear of failure, fear of success. And so we avoid doing the hard work. We avoid putting in the extra effort. I laugh back about me working out, my fear of success. I remember thinking, Cory, basketball was probably one of my favorite sports, maybe my best sport. And they kept trying to get me to work out. And I was like, well, if I work out, I get big and strong like Cory, it's going to affect my shot. And so now I've never thought about that as a fear of success until today as we're doing the podcast. And so I avoided going to the weight room. What does somebody my size need more than anything else? They need more strength. And so you kind of self-sabotage and you talk yourself into something. And if you tell yourself something long enough, you'll believe it. So I believe if I worked out really hard, it was going to affect my shot in basketball. And I was become really stiff and not flexible, which I'm not flexible anyway. But I think that's a very good example of the procrastination, the avoidance, doing the thing that's really going to move the needle forward.
Yeah. Yeah, I think self-handicapping can show up in a lot of ways, and you mentioned some there. But if you think about, I think some people, it was interesting in doing some research. One of the fear of success, one of the things that people will do, and this sounds counterintuitive, but they just say yes to everything.
Yeah.
It's almost like they just sort of bury themselves in work so much that they can't take on the kind of responsibilities that probably will move the needle to drive success.
Yes.
So they just, it's almost like they just purposefully engage in activity to avoid achievement.
Yeah.
One of the other common ones, avoiding leadership roles or taking on additional responsibilities, because again, sort of the threat that comes with, well, now if I'm expected to have more responsibility or to lead people, or like they don't want that burden, and so they just avoid it.
Yeah, go back to that imposter syndrome. That imposter anxiety is like, hey, I don't want this extra burden. I don't want this extra pressure. I just want to do this.
Yep.
And I want my life to be easy, and I don't want to stress myself out.
Yeah, I think the fear of failure is where you're going to find like overtraining or over preparing.
Yes.
Right. So you're trying to overcompensate some type of your perceived maybe inadequacy. So that's where you get those perfectionistic tendencies, almost of doing, like you're just overthinking it. You're overdoing everything because you believe that it has to be perfect in order to get the result or outcome that you want, or else it will fail.
A really good example, Scotty Shaffer. What's the biggest knock on him the last couple of years is his putting. And as he rolled the ball really well at the PGA, I think it was, he talked about in the past couple of years, he had spent so much time, so much effort. He had tried so hard to control that he had gotten farther away. Mm-hmm. And it was that perfectionist tendency. He just had to kind of let go of that expectation, let go of that perfectionism, and just kind of allow himself to get in that present moment.
Yeah, I think there are others, and I'll just mention these quickly, and then we'll push to our next section here. But I think even maybe in sort of like the goal setting process, you're going to have people who, especially for probably both, to be honest, failure or success, is they want to set a low bar.
Yeah.
Right? If I'm afraid to fail, well, setting a low bar feels comfortable. If I'm afraid of success and going too high, then setting a lower bar certainly helps me feel like I'm not out kicking my coverage. So
I just protect myself.
Yeah.
And I think you talked about that protection methods, but I just don't want to push myself. And I think it also lets me play a little bit of an excuse game in my mind. Well, if I'd have worked really hard, if I'd have done this, if I'd have done that, then I it kind of tries to protect our identity a little bit, mm-hmm. that we make these excuses because we didn't work hard enough.
Yeah. And then I think, maybe the extreme is you get some self-destructive behaviors. So completely neglecting health and wellness, just not taking care of myself. Maybe this is where you get into substance abuse and that type of thing. Ultimately, it's like these are just ways that fear sort of manifests itself.
Yes.
And I just end up sabotaging what I'm doing, whether it's conscious or not. I think you can probably imagine some extreme examples of that. Maybe that's really likely in the corporate space. I think that's where you're likely to see some of this kind of stuff in the worlds that we live in, like coaches.
Yes.
Right? Coaches who maybe have a fear. This is when they probably head down a rabbit hole of getting into some, behaviors that aren't great, that type of thing.
Well, you can see some of these high performers across sports, across every culture. They turn to alcohol, they turn to medication, they turn to marijuana, because what have we talked about? I'm trying to escape that pressure, that fear, that anxiety, that elevated cortisol, and I use drugs and other substances or other addictions to cope and help me escape that pressure.
Right. All right. Let's talk about intervention. So this is now, sort of the work that we do here. How do we go about people who are either struggling with fear of failure? if they're struggling with the fear of success, like what does it look like? What are we trying to address, or how are we going about this work? So where do you want to start?
Well, I love starting with the cognitive restructuring. I think you know what, that's so near and dear to me, being a cognitive psychologist. And so I think, first of all, we do this a lot. I mean, one of the very first questions we start asking people is, how do you define success and how do you define failure? And if we can move beyond those traditional definitions, like we can move beyond success is achieving a goal and that failure is not achieving it, then we help reframe the conversation around success and failure. That we can tie it to a process. We can measure our effort instead of the outcome. And the outcome kind of becomes a byproduct or an indicator of our processes, of our inputs. And so if we can reframe and rethink success and failure, it then gives us a chance to change our language, to change the way we think about ourselves and about our work and about the games that we're playing.
Yeah, well said. Again, I think that's pretty core to what we do, and a lot of people who are doing work in our space and just trying to help you shift your mindset around, what does success and failure even mean? The one that I've actually used specifically, and why I wanted to touch on this, I remember working with a client years ago, an athlete who, this was like the first time I had come across working with somebody with the fear of success, and it was fascinating. And so what I tried to do, going back to sort of a classic theory in psychology, self-determination theory, basically what this theory says is human beings have three primary psychological needs: competence, autonomy, so freedom of choice, and then relatedness. And so the competence and autonomy, especially the competence piece, you can see how that's sort of threatened, especially with the fear of failure. Autonomy, like the freedom of choice or input, to feel like I have some agency in my life or in what I'm doing. And then lastly is relatedness, and feeling sort of connected to other people in the process, or feeling connected to something larger than yourself. And the more I got to know this individual, it felt like she was that piece was really important to her.
Yes.
And so within her fear of success, I tried to tap back into, hey, what about doing this, not just for you, but for your teammates? Like, that's something that I knew was important to her. So shifting her focus away from, well, success means all these certain things about me, to, well, think about how it helps and the joy that it's going to bring to your teammates and all the people who support you and that type of thing. And that was a really important shift for her to make, inside her mind, because just knowing like that was a value that she had, and the people around her were important to her. So it was shifting it from almost this magnifying glass on her to like, hey, let's just focus on, if you play at your best, the impact that's going to have on all these other people. And that was helpful. So
the research in terms of just trauma, Cory, really supports that. The research kind of suggests, in order to get over a traumatic event, and in whatever form of life, you got to be good at something. You got to have some sense of mastery, some sense of agency. I like that language. And you got to have a good team around you. You got to be a part of something bigger than yourself. And so it really supports, how do we deal with that elevated stress over time? We got to stay connected.
Mm-hmm. All right. Any final thoughts here, or any other interventions you want to hit on before we wrap up?
Well, I think part of this is, language, hopefully people have heard me say a long time, is giving yourself permission to be human. Our brains were created to protect us from threats, and whether that's a threat of failure or a threat of success, understanding the physiological and emotional and mental responses to stress. And an example I use all the time is Steph Curry says he gets nervous before every game. And understand that that's part of the process. If you're trying to do something difficult, and accepting some of that anxiety, accepting some of that stress, giving yourself permission to be human. But being human means we get to push the limits of what we think is possible. And it's really difficult sometimes to do it by yourself.
Yeah, well said. There's probably plenty of meat on the bone here that we could dive into, but hopefully this has provided our listeners just a little bit of insight. Again, I use the word, maybe helps you feel a little bit seen or validates some of what you felt over the course of your career, and maybe giving you some things to think about in terms of, how does this show up for me, if I'm honest, right? The fear of failure or the fear of success, any of the behaviors or the coping strategies that we mentioned, maybe, that's a tough pill to swallow, to acknowledge, hey, unfortunately, I've been down that road. But even just hearing just a couple of reminders there from cognitive restructuring, self-determination theory, sort of identity, any of those things is helpful for you. So again, hopefully you guys got something out of the episode. I mentioned from the start, I feel like this is probably something that everybody can relate to in some capacity. So we look forward to hearing from you guys. If you have any feedback or questions, follow-ups that we can take a deeper dive into, by all means, send those our way. As always, you can check out Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Like us, rate us, review us, so we can keep getting better for you. And we'll see you next time on The Growth Project.